When we talk about the race for space, it doesn't start during the Kennedy administration. And I told you I'd kind of get to this later. What happened is it actually began, and we talked about this, on October 4th of 1957. That's when the race for space started. It was October 4th, 1957. Why? You should know this. Sputnik 1 went up. Okay, that was a Soviet satellite that went up, scared Americans to death, because if we could send satellites into space, what would be next? Military weapons, etc. So the race for space actually started on October 4th of 1957. Not long after that, what did they shoot up again? Sputnik 2. And now we're really nervous. So in 1958, the United States government creates what we know as the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, better known as NASA, because we were behind 2-0 in this race for space. So the American government's getting heat. Gee whiz, are we behind the Russians? Gee whiz, are their kids smarter than us? Are their astronauts, we don't even have it, are they making astronauts? They call them cosmonauts. Are they ahead of us? So all of a sudden, we decide we better get in the game. So late in the Eisenhower administration, the United States government forms NASA in 1958. And their first space program is going to be known as the Mercury Project. And I'll just give you, you don't have to write all this down, but a precursor to this is that our first space program is Mercury. Our second space program was Gemini. And our third was Apollo. But Mercury was the first space program that the United States had under the direction of NASA. So we're kind of getting our stuff together and we're trying to catch up a little bit. And what do we do in the meantime? Did we not send a spaceship into space? And what did it have in it? Monkeys. And so we're getting back in the game. Well, all of a sudden on April 12th of 1961, during the Kennedy administration, the Soviets send up a cosmonaut, a human being by the name of Yuri Gagarin, into space. And he not only becomes the first human being in space, but he becomes the first human being to circle or orbit the Earth one time. Now we're really panicked because we are way behind. We're behind 2-1, but we're way behind because they have sent a human being not only into space, but this man, this cosmonaut, has orbited the Earth as well. Now, I'm just going to give you a little information, write it down if you want, that when Kennedy was president-elect, he wasn't that hot on NASA. He thought that this space thing was kind of going to be a waste of money. He really did. He wasn't behind it at first. Well, when Yuri Gagarin gets into space and circles the globe, Kennedy has got to start supporting, and he throws his full support behind this Mercury project because he knows we are in trouble. But at first, he wasn't that hot on it. Okay? So, Kennedy proclaims at this point, when he gets behind Mercury, that the Americans will land on the moon and return safely by the end of the decade. That's when he made that almost unbelievable promise early in the 1960s. And it was after he committed to Mercury, after Yuri Gagarin circled the globe. We had to get in gear. So Kennedy gets on board with NASA, and he makes the prediction that man will land on the moon and return safely by the end of the decade. Well, the start of that far-fetched goal is going to be the Mercury project, because it's going to be Apollo 11 that gets us to the moon, and we're going to have Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo prior to that. Okay? So that will take us then to the Mercury space program, and I'll tell you how this whole thing unfolds. The Mercury space program. Now, it was back in the Eisenhower administration, before Kennedy took office, that NASA contacted the Department of Defense. And they said, listen, fellas, give us a list of military pilots in all branches of the services that could be considered in your mind to be an astronaut. We want good pilots. Give us a list of the best pilots you have in all branches of the armed services, and we're going to try to make some astronauts out of these guys. And the Defense Department responded to NASA with 500 508 names. Now make sure you get these numbers down. 508 names were given to NASA as possible pilots that could be astronauts. 508. Well, not long after NASA got that list of 508, they trimmed it quickly to 473. So it went from 508 to 473 pretty quick. They just kind of looked at the list and said, yeah, we can, this one no, and they got to 473. They would evaluate those 473 men left on their age and their height. That would be the next cut, age and height. You had to be less than 40 years old, and you could be no taller than 5'11". So the next 473 are going to be cut down based on their age and based on their height. They had to be less than 40 years old and no taller than 5'11". Ryland, this isn't basketball, I guess, so why do they want someone no taller than 5'11"?
Because whatever is smallest time.
The capsule, yeah, very little. So he couldn't be a big person and fit the capsule that they had designed. 5'11". Yep. Well, I'm 6'2", so it's smaller than I am. How tall are you, Alexa?
5'8".
Okay, so you'd qualify. McKenna?
5'9".
Okay, you'd qualify. We don't have a real lot of tall girls in there, but you had to be 5'11". Now, that list of 473 was then trimmed down to 110. Went from 473 to 110. They had a lot of tall pilots, that's right. And I don't know what the H factor was of the 473, but they trimmed it to 110. Of those 110, 69 were sent to Washington, D.C. for a briefing. So they cut from 110 to 69. They send these 69 pilots to Washington, D.C. They're going to interview them and test them intellectually to see if they're going to make it in the Mercury space program. So these 69 pilots are sent to Washington, D.C. They're going to interview them and test them academically, so to speak, intellectually, and see if they're going to make the grade. Well, after they interviewed and tested, they cut to 47. So far we've gone from 508 to 47. So they cut down to 47 after interviews and intellectual testing. They then cut that 47 down to 32, and they send those 32 pilots to New Mexico for physical examinations, stress evaluations, and psychological testing. So they send 32 of those 47 to New Mexico, where they will put them through physical examinations, stress evaluations, and psychological testing. Physical examinations, stress evaluations, and psychological testing. Quite a process. Well, after they get done with those 32, they cut down to a final 7. They cut down to a final 7. So of the 508 possibilities, the Mercury project will consist of 7 pilots who are now going to be known as astronauts. Okay? Now, they were picked, according to NASA, for these 3 attributes. These are the 3 things they used to pick these 7. They picked them for their experience. NASA picked them for their skill. And NASA picked them for their physical fitness. They were picked for their experience, their skill, and their physical fitness, which NASA called a unique combination of the right stuff. Unique combination of the right stuff. You ever hear that expression when somebody's picked for something? Say, yeah, they had the right stuff. Now it all goes back to the selection of the Mercury 7 astronauts. Their experience, their skill, their physical fitness, NASA called those attributes the right stuff. And from this point on, these 7 men will become known in American history as the Mercury 7 astronauts. To tell you a little bit about this, it's kind of interesting. They're going to be kind of a new breed of Americans. heroes, new breed of American heroes. They are going to be almost like celebrities because they're going to become so popular with the public. They're like movie stars. They're like sports heroes. They become celebrities because they are going to be the first Americans in space. And they spent a lot of time together, and so they developed great, or the C word, camaraderie. They developed great camaraderie. And they were so into that camaraderie that each pilot will name their capsule that will fly into space, but they will all end in the the number 7. So Nick might name his capsule Lawton. It'll be Lawton 7. Naya names hers Campbell, Campbell 7. They all named their capsules, but they ended it in 7 to make light of the fact that they were a camaraderie, that they were the first 7, they were a group, and solid. Now, these 7 men will come from 3 branches of the military, and we'll tell you who they are. Here are the Mercury 7 astronauts. From the United States Air Force, we have 3. United States Air Force, we have 3. Captain Gordon Cooper Jr., age 34. Captain Gordon Cooper Jr., age 34. Captain Donald Deke Slayton, age 35. Captain Donald Deke Slayton, age 35. And Captain Virgil Gus Grissom, age 33. From the United States Air Force, Captain Gordon Cooper Jr., age 34, Captain Donald Deke Slayton, age 35, and Captain Virgil Gus Grissom, age 33. Those men will represent the United States Air Force. You have 3 of the Mercury 7 astronauts that will represent the United States Navy. The United States Navy. Lieutenant Commander Alan Shepard Jr., age 35. Lieutenant Commander Alan Shepard Jr., age 35. Lieutenant Scott Carpenter, age 33. Lieutenant Scott Carpenter, age 33. Lieutenant Commander Walter Sharara Jr., age 36. From the Navy, Lieutenant Commander Alan Shepard Jr., age 35. Lieutenant Scott Carpenter, age 33. And Lieutenant Commander Walter Sharara Jr., age 36. One lone Marine. Probably a more famous name that you've heard, Lieutenant Colonel John Glenn Jr., age 38. Lieutenant Colonel John Glenn Jr., age 38. Your Mercury 7 astronauts, Gordon Cooper Jr., Donald Deke Slayton, Virgil Gus Grissom, Alan Shepard Jr., Scott Carpenter, Walter Sharara Jr., and John Glenn Jr. Which will take us to our next subtopic, the Mercury Flight Achievements. These 7 astronauts are going to fly 6 missions. So someone on this list is not going to fly a Mercury mission, and we'll let you know who that is at the end, by process of elimination. All right, here we go. The first Mercury flight, Freedom 7, May 5th, 1961. Freedom 7, May 5th, 1961. It is considered a suborbital flight. Nick, what's that mean? Suborbital. It's either orbital or suborbital. What's orbital? Went around the Earth. So if it's suborbital, it did not go around. Okay, very good. It was commanded by Alan Shepard Jr. He becomes the man that gets to be the first American in space. Alan Shepard Jr. becomes the first American in space. Now, since this is a suborbital flight, kiddos, it doesn't go around the Earth. It's simply rocketed 118 miles into space, and landed 15 minutes later. The capsule weighed approximately 3,000 pounds and traveled at a top speed of 5,180 miles per hour. So, Freedom 7, commanded by Alan Shepard Jr., he becomes the first American in space. He rockets 117 miles into space, lands about 15 minutes later. Freedom 7 weighed approximately 3,000 pounds and reached a top speed of 5,180 miles per hour. Now this is an interesting story. I apologize in advance, but it is history. Shepard was pretty nervous. I mean, he didn't know whether he was going to survive getting off the launch pad. This is the first rocket into space. Is there a possibility this could go bad? Absolutely. And he's pretty nervous, and he's on the mic, and he doesn't realize he's on the mic, and he says prior to liftoff, "Please, dear God, don't let me F up." Only he didn't, he went the full blown. That quote became known in aviation history as Shepard's Prayer. A little oxymoron, but that's what it was called.
What was the quote again?
Okay. "Please, dear God, don't let me F up." You don't really have to write that down. I think that the significance of saying it has gotten in your mind. But that quote did go down in aviation history as Shepard's Prayer. There's a movie out, it's old now, maybe you've watched it because you've been bored. You ever seen a movie called Space Cowboys? It's a movie about guys in the 1950s, and Clint Eastwood's one of the actors, that they never got a chance to go into space, and now they're going to get a chance to go into space in modern times because of a Russian rocket that's up there that's bothering people. And they're all excited, and they get picked because of their experience, and they're going to team up with some young astronauts, and just before they take off they're nervous, and one of the old geezers repeats Shepard's Prayer, not with the F, but uses a different term. And it was just kind of ironic because it brought back the history that he was so nervous that he said something similar. So anyway, it was not meant to be inappropriate. It was meant to show that this guy was incredibly nervous about being the first man in space and whether he was coming back.
Isn't there a song called Space Cowboy?
And probably his theme song.
Like that?
Well, that's Steve Miller. That's a whole different thing. Now, you don't have to write this stuff down, but I want you to listen because I think it's important. Shepard was grounded from 1963 to 1969 because he had an ear disorder. But he got back in the saddle, and in 1971, he commanded Apollo 14, which was the third moon landing. We had more than one. It was the third one. While he was on the moon, I think this is so cool. While he's on the moon, he takes out a 6-iron and hits 2 golf balls off the surface of the moon. Did, true. And the balls, he said, went forever and ever because there's no gravity. The golf club he used is in the National Air and Space Museum, and you can see that when you get in D.C. It's pretty cool. It's sitting right there. There's a golf club. He whacked balls on the moon. Pretty interesting. Well, anyway, he resigned from the Navy in 1974 at the rank of Rear Admiral. That's a pretty high ranking. And unfortunately died of leukemia at the age of 74. And his wife of 53 years died 5 weeks later. Both were cremated, and their ashes were committed to the sea, which is pretty normal for a Navy. That was your first flight. Second flight, Liberty Bell 7, July 21st, 1961. July 21st, 1961. It was also a suborbital flight. Liberty Bell 7, July 21st, 1961, suborbital flight. It was commanded by Virgil Gus Grissom. Therefore, he becomes the second American in space. And his mission was similar to Shepard's. He went 118 miles above the Earth's surface and landed about 15 minutes also. So it was very similar. He had a little bit worse ending, though, because when these capsules come back from space, where do they land? In the ocean. Well, when his capsule landed in the ocean, and they were pretty close to it because they know where they're going to land, the hatch pops open prematurely and the vessel fills with water. And it's a small vessel. He barely gets out and the vessel sinks to the bottom of the ocean, which it was recovered maybe 5 or 6 years ago is all. Okay? So he almost was killed because he almost drowned with the vessel. Now, you don't really have to write this down. I'm just going to tell you because we'll talk about it later. Sadly, He also flew in the Gemini project, because remember it was Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, and he was set to command Apollo 1. These were the missions that were going to prepare us for the moon landing. Well, unfortunately, he was killed in Apollo 1 when a fire swept through the command module during a test on the launch pad at Cape Kennedy. Really a sad story. Burned him and 2 other astronauts to death. So, as I look on my board up there, and I'm very proud of the fact I have 6 of the 7 Mercury astronauts' signatures. The one I do not have is Virgil Gus Grissom, because he died in 1967, and anything he signed is 50 years old, so to speak, and they're very expensive. So I don't have them, but someday I may. All right, the next flight, probably the most famous of the Mercury flights, was Friendship 7. Friendship 7. And it was February 20th of 1962. February 20th of 1962. And who commanded that? John Glenn Jr. And what did he become the first American to do? Orbit. Very good. Orbit the Earth. So, Friendship 7, February 20th, 1962. It was commanded by John Glenn Jr. He will become the first American to orbit the Earth. And he bests Yuri Gagarin, because how many times did Yuri Gagarin go? Once. He went 3 times. And it was at this point that Americans felt like we were winning the race for space with the Russians. This is how big of a deal that John Glenn's orbital flight of 3 orbits was to American morale. Okay? And he did that in less than 5 hours. So he circled the Earth 3 times in less than 5 hours. And as I mentioned, the success of Glenn's flight helped overcome fears that the Russians were winning the race for space. We really believed at this time that we were in control. Glenn never flew again as an astronaut